I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, we're still doing the bi-weekly thing, and you're still working on finishing that translation. So I think in some of the upcoming episodes, I may just do me episodes only with me, if that's okay with you, Rob.
Go for it.
Okay, cool. Listener, if you hear some episodes just with me and you're like, where is Rob? I need Rob. That's what's going on. All right, Rob, today it's part 4 of our accidental series on the Zhuangzi. We're looking at autumn floods.
One of the most famous passages in the Zhuangzi, I would have to say.
You had read this before today, right?
Yes, this is one of the passages that I studied when I was taking classical Chinese in grad school.
Gun?
Now, this is the one I took with Monica, our good friend Monica McClellan, also PhD from my department, comparative literature.
A scholar who now, works in university administration, but is one of those stunning scholars. We actually interviewed her for the podcast. I don't think we ever aired it because
the sound quality was so bad. It's one of those we listened to. Oof.
We just, in the beginning, we had such bad sound quality with this podcast.
Anyway, but this particular passage is translatable, is readable for students of classical Chinese. It's kind of interesting that way. It's not John Grisham or something. You can't just pick it up and go, oh, I got this. It requires work, but it's also not completely opaque. So it's interesting.
It's one of the most literary passages in the entirety of the Zhuangzi. We kind of have tiptoed around this question of genre, but we are the Chinese Literature Podcast, so it's kind of bold for us to go, this is the most important work of literature in Chinese philosophy. How do you make that claim? Because philosophy is philosophy and literature is literature, but that's not really true, and that's especially not true of early Chinese literature. Philosophy becomes literature, literature becomes philosophy. They're all back and forth. It's not until really the Han Dynasty, so about 400 or 500 years after this is being written, that you really have distinct genres in the Chinese literary tradition. And even then, it's still kind of protean. You can go back and forth. Something can be one thing, and it can also be another part of another genre. And I would say that that's true up until fairly recent times, right, Rob?
Right. This is, in the form of this one, is a little bit like a parable, but it's also, if it is a parable, it's an unbelievably long parable. The whole thing is a discussion between the Yellow River and the Northern Sea, or the god of the Yellow River and the god of the Northern Sea. Or if you're reading Victor Mayer's translation, as we are, the Earl of the Yellow River and the Overlord of the North Sea.
Whatever those different titles mean.
Yeah, exactly. I've never known what Earl, aside from the song Duke of Earl. I don't have any idea what it really means. But, of course, I don't know what it means in that song either, so whatever. Anyway, so in the narrative, in fact, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's very, very long. I'm just going to read the first part because it's a nice setup for everything that follows. So here's how it starts out. When the time of the autumn floods arrived, the 100 tributaries poured into the Yellow River. Its onrushing current was so huge that one could not discern an ox or a horse on the opposite side or on the banks of its islets. Thereupon, the Earl of the River delightedly congratulated himself at having complete and sole possession of all excellences under heaven. Following along with the current, he went east until he reached the Northern Sea. There he looked eastward, but could not see the water's end. Whereupon he crestfallenly gazed across the surface of the sea, and said with a sigh to its overlord, "There is a proverb that says, 'He who has heard the way 100 times believes no one may be compared to himself.' This applies to me. Furthermore, when I first heard those who belittled the learning of Confucius and disparaged the righteousness of Puyi, I did not believe them. But now that I behold your boundlessness, I realize that had I not come to your gate, I would have been in danger, and would have been ridiculed forever by the practitioners of the great method. The overlord of the Northern Sea said, 'You can't tell a frog at the bottom of a well about the sea because he's stuck in his little space. You can't tell a summer insect about ice because it is confined by its season. You can't tell a scholar of distorted views about the way because he is bound by his doctrine. Now you have ventured forth from your banks to observe the great sea and have recognized your own insignificance, so that you can be told of the great principle. So you have the sort of the important elements here, right? You have this character who goes, I am awesome, and then meets a way more awesome character and goes, maybe not so awesome, actually, after all. But the really awesome character says, that's good, though. It's good that you realize that. Now let's talk. So we know we're about to get a discussion of comparisons, which is mostly what follows, but we'll see if we can get to the bottom of it. It's an incredibly complex passage.
So 2 things, Rob, I think the listener should take away from this passage. One is humility. Zhuangzi is saying, hey, you may think you're awesome, but there's always someone who's much more awesome than you. He has that passage about the frog in the well who can't know the like wideness of the world because of the limits of the frog's own world. The mosquito can't know what winter is like because they're only a summer insect. We need to recognize the limits of our knowledge and have humility. That's one of the main messages, not only in this passage, but throughout the Zhuangzi. You have to have humility about the limits of your knowledge. Second, that comparativeness that you mentioned, Rob, is a big deal in Zhuangzi. He's always talking about comparisons. And even, we didn't get to this passage, I don't think, the part where the god of the Yellow River runs into the god of the Northern Sea. The god of the Northern Sea even says, hey, you know what? I thought I was awesome too, but then I looked around at the heavens and realized I'm actually just a kind of puny little nothing. We're all nothings in comparison to something bigger, and we're all quite big in comparison to something puny. We need to keep that comparative perspective in mind, and that's something that emerges from a lot of different parts of Zhuangzi's text. That's one of the main takeaways, I would say, if you're reading the Zhuangzi.
One of the important aspects of that comparison, that humility in Zhuangzi, is not one, because at some point the river says, wow, you're so much bigger than I do. And then the Northern Sea goes, hey, actually, the heavens are bigger than me. And then the Earl of the River says this being so, may I take heaven and earth as the standard for what is large, and the tip of a downy hair as the standard for what is small? No, said the Overlord of the North Sea. Things are limitless in their capacities, incessant in their occurrences, inconstant in their portions, uncertain in their beginning and ending. So the point being that there's a tendency to think, oh, I get it. Okay, so here's what big really is. This is big. This is small. Cool. I think we're good here. And again, let's bring it back to Butcher Ting, right? What the Northern Sea is telling the Yellow River is not, it's important that you know how super small you are, right? That's not what he's saying. He's saying there are aspects of comparison that run through even a single thing, right? He says their capacities are limitless, and he'll kind of repeat that later on in the text. There's no demarcation. There's no saying this thing is 100% small, this thing is 100% big. I like this little sentence. This is kind of following on that idea. Later on, the Northern Sea says this, observed in the light of gradations, if we consider to be large what is larger than something else, then the myriad things are without exception large. If we consider to be small what is smaller than something else, then all the myriad things are without exception small. Observed in the light of merit, if we grant whatever merit they have, then the myriad things without exception have merit. So anyway, there's this dynamic of saying if you're still trying to define a thing by another thing, and I mean define, like this mountain is bigger than this tree, therefore the mountain is big. Zhuangzi's point is, well, then everything is big because it's always bigger than something else. I mean, forever, basically. So the humility doesn't come from saying, I'm small and that's big. Humility comes from, at least here, saying there's an aspect of big and small in everything I see, and it's the way that's truly big. And that's what I should be striving for.
I read somewhere that it was Indian mathematicians who discovered the concept of infinity. I would have to push back on that and say that Zhuangzi is probably the earliest writer to write about infinity. I don't think he has the kind of mathematical language that Indian mathematicians were able to come up with and talk about infinity in a very sophisticated way, in a way that I should point out informed both Chinese and Arab and Western mathematics millennia after Indian philosophers and mathematicians invented it. But I think you can see Zhuangzi hitting at this philosophical concept, which, we think infinity, of course, that's something that just exists, but this is a concept that was invented fairly late in human history, and it was something that encountered some resistance from thinkers. It was hard to kind of conceptualize infinity, like it includes everything, it keeps going. But Zhuangzi, he's writing 400, 500, 600 years. We don't actually know when he was writing, if he actually was writing, but he's writing several centuries before the birth of Christ. You have this really sophisticated way of thinking about the world, something that I don't think people outside of Zhuangzi, I'm not even going to say outside of China, because I don't think Zhuangzi has any philosopher who's comparable to him. I don't think people outside of Zhuangzi really catch up to him for about 1,000 years.
At least. And in fact, you had your sort of two things you think are takeaways to this chapter. I would add a third, which is that everything, not everyone, everything can teach you something. And because here in the passage, there's a point where the Northern Sea, I love the Yellow River, the god of the Yellow River, or Yellow River, whatever, it gets frustrated and goes, then what am I to do? Asked the Earl of the Yellow River. And what am I not to do with regard to rejecting and accepting, taking and giving? How should I behave? And I love that because that's exactly what anyone reading Zhuangzi at some point is going to do. Like, all right, seriously though, like, what am I supposed to do? Like, all you keep doing is telling all the stuff it's not. Where am I supposed to go with this? And there's a neat little, just a very brief sort of description of how this works. And the Northern Sea says, what is prized and what is despised may be referred to as alternating developments of each other. And then later on says, embosom all the myriad things, taking each one under your protective wings. This may be referred to as universality. That term universality to me gets a little bit at the infinity you were talking about. But this notion of no matter what it can teach you is way ahead of its time, because I think there are romantic poets in the European tradition who would say something like, nature can truly be your teacher, but that's not a major strain in the Greeks, and that's not a major strain in European philosophy, where what separates human beings from the beasts is our reason, right? So why would you go learn from a snail? There's nothing to learn there. The snail can't reason.
And that's coming 2,000 plus years after Zhuangzi's writing. Really, you don't get romanticism, I would say, until, I hate to date it to 1798 and lyrical ballads by Coleridge and Wordsworth, but I'm going to do that anyways. I guess you might have something earlier in the German romantic tradition, but I don't know that as well. But we're talking, more than 2,000 years after Zhuangzi's writing. Then Europeans are catching up with it. That kind of suggests how flipping awesome Zhuangzi is and how informative reading him is. Rob, I wanted to ask you, I don't know if it's fair to call you a student of comedy, but you're an observer of British comedy, right?
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever feel like this was kind of one of those comedy duos where you have the straight man versus the funny man? You have the god of the Yellow River and the god of the Northern Sea kind of doing this comedy routine?
It does feel like if you can substitute sort of some of the Northern Sea's vast pronouncements with some really solid jokes, it's classic sort of vaudeville crosstalk, which is still big in China, actually. Can you have the one person going, I see, it's like this? No, it's not like that at all, right? Or then what am I supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? I'll tell you what you're supposed to do. It does have that. It does have a lot of that kind of dynamic.
Who's on first?
Yeah, exactly. That Abbott and Costello sort of back and forth. I think we just compared the Northern Sea and the Yellow River to Abbott and Costello. I guarantee no one's ever done that before.
Yeah. Well, that's what our podcast does. We're breaking boundaries.
Maybe boundaries that should have remained, but we're going to break them anyway.
But Zhuangzi would want us to break those
Yes,
boundaries. He doesn't.
absolutely.
He doesn't see the need for a boundary.
No.
Our podcast is breaking the riverbanks and creating its own northern sea.
That's it. That's exactly what we're doing. Now, and this is will be my closing thought really on the passage, but a lot of this grandiose discussion is kind of designed to work kind of like a battering ram or something. Let's break apart this stuff and bring it down to something very simple, right? I'm going to make this super complicated because it is complicated, but in terms of practice, what does it mean? What it means is never pass up an opportunity to learn something, right? A blade of grass has something you could learn if you really paid attention.
Wasn't that the whole point of that Walt Whitman?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. Seriously,
I thought you were alluding to that. Were you not alluding to that intentionally?
I was not, but that makes sense.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Okay.
Unconsciously channeling Whitman. I'm definitely an American.
I was just in Brooklyn.
Nice. There you go. So yeah, you can learn from anything, and the true Taoist adept is someone who understands that to their core. That it's not about that I am big and this thing is small, but that thing's size is different than mine. What can someone of my size learn from a thing of that size? That's a fairly profound thought.
So I mentioned the takeaways of humility, which is something that, Rob, I think you'll agree, I definitely need to take away from this passage.
All people need to.
But me more so than others. And kind of this question of relativity. One other thing I want to leave the listener with, read this passage and look at how beautiful it is. In terms of literature, this is one of the most fantastic passages in the entire Zhuangzi as a story. Rob, you said it was sort of a parable, but it's a little long to be a parable. I think it's totally a parable. You're right, it is a long parable, but it's totally a beautifully written parable, and I think it challenges any parable that we see in the Zhuangzi or in any other literary tradition. I think it's a fantastic read. Check it out. We used Victor Mayer's translation, Wandering the Way, but there are several other translations I just want to point out. I think Burton Watson, who's a famous translator, has has a translation of Zhuangzi. A.C. Graham, I think, is probably the best translator of Zhuangzi, but A.C. Graham only translates the Nebian, the inner chapters. So since Autumn Floods is not a part of the inner chapters, he doesn't have a translation of this. I don't believe, unless he has kind of some scraps at the end there. But I don't think he does. So check it out. I would recommend Victor Mayer's translation of this passage. Rob, any final thoughts?
That's it. I already gave mine.
Rob, if they need more Chinese literature podcasts, since we're doing this bi-weekly schedule and you might be hankering for more, where should they go?
Well, first of all, as we get emails from people occasionally who tell us they've just discovered this, we do have a website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. If you like this, you can get all the other episodes there. You can binge, listen.
We put our translations of poetry on the website. Obviously you can binge listen on your favorite podcast app, but the website does have a bit more if you're looking for a little bit. It's not much more, but if you want to check out our translations and critique them, please let us know, because
yes,
we have done some bad translations and we need to be critiqued.
So has everyone. Well, everyone doing Chinese literature anyway. But you can also, of course, find us at Twitter at ChinLitPod, Chinese Literature Podcast at gmail.com, and Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.